Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, the Switch Detective. By Kurt Matchell. The Switch Detective. First chapter. Inspector Baxter's hero. I should like to know how that everywhere and nowhere knows what I have told our club, said Mr. Hop to several gentlemen who stood in his study, squeezing like a living wall around the huge iron wall safe. Raffles hears everything, replied Inspector Baxter, but I'll bet, Mr. Hop, that we'll have that gentleman who's infesting all of London in 3 days. I have already delivered other pieces. He was silent for a few moments, and the others nodded in agreement, as if to add force to his words. It is very bold, said the manufacturer Hop, to send me a message, as Raffles has ventured, reading once more half aloud the letter which lay before him on the green table. To James Hop and Company. London. Dear Sir. I heard, 12 hours ago, that you made a very daring statement in your club. You have argued that Raffles could never visit you without recognizing him at once, and that it was absolutely impossible to steal from you. And, Mr. Hop, you added a few words to this statement, which were precisely no flattery to me. As I was just planning to support a few poor people again, the funds you have at your disposal come in handy. Surely you will not be so cowardly as to empty your iron safe, which is made according to the latest system, and entrust your valuable papers to a bank. I accept your challenge, which makes me extraordinary much pleasure, and inform you that tomorrow, between 3 and 5 o'clock, I shall have the pleasure of visiting you. I intend to take £500 from your safe. You will certainly understand that I will not let anything and anyone stop me from my intention, taking my person into account. So see you again. Your affectionate John C. Raffles. Manufacturer Hop looked round with a slight shiver as he repeated Raffles' name, and he had a feeling as if the great unknown was already haunting the office. But none were there but the 4 detectives, who, led by Baxter, guarded the safe. The inspector laughed when Hop had finished reading the letter. That is foolishness. Great folly. The great unknown thinks he can make fun of everything, but this time he really cut his fingers. I, Inspector Baxter, will catch him in the act, lay my hand on his shoulder and say, My dear Raffles, it is our great pleasure that you have visited us. We will do our best to keep you with us as long as possible. Everyone laughed. In the same instant the door opened. It became dead quiet. A liveryman entered and brought a business card on a silver tray. Fritz Reinhardt, engineer, he read, Come in. Moments later, a slender-built young man entered, neatly dressed, hair parted in the middle. Engineer Reinhardt, he introduced himself. I come on behalf of Kohlenhorst and Rifling, to negotiate with you a contract to be concluded concerning ironworks. You know, Mr. Hop, that the odds are very good for you, and that you can make good business. The engineer talked about several other things. In the meantime he approached the safe apparently quite by accident, looked at the structure, reasoning incessantly, and ran the right hand along the very intricate lock, as if searching for a secret spring. Stop! Cried Hop suddenly, and in the next instant he had grabbed the revolver that lay on his desk and held it up to the engineer's nose. The latter leapt sideways and flung the manufacturer's outstretched arm upward, so that the bulkhead flew creakingly into the attic. Have you gone mad? Exclaimed the engineer. Help! Help! We are already coming, said Inspector Baxter, who had hid with the detectives in the adjoining room and now appeared. In an instant the mysterious engineer was surrounded and held by them, so that he could not move. "You are Raffles," said Baxter curtly. The engineer looked wide-eyed at the inspector. "Raffles? Me Raffles? You are insane. I'm Engineer Reinhardt, got it? Is all London upside down then?" "No excuses," replied Baxter sternly. "You have approached the safe in all too remarkable a way." "Naturally. She caught my attention." "Ah, so. You wanted to learn the construction of the castle." "Right. Is that forbidden here?" "No. But why are you so interested in it?" "Because we manufacture safes and I represent my company." But neither the inspector nor Hop believed this talk, and the detectives moved the prisoner into an adjacent room to hand him over to the police when it got dark without causing a stir. Meanwhile the liveryman came in for the second time. In military stance he stopped before Hop and said, "Franz Werner asks to speak to Mr. Hop." The manufacturer's eyebrows furrowed. "Franz Werner, the foreman I fired? Anyway, leave him here." The detainee was guarded in the adjoining room by one of the detectives. The others had posted themselves in front of the safe. The old man, stooping into the room, looked in amazement at the uniforms in front of the safe. Franz Werner was about the same age as Hop. But what a difference! There behind the writing table stood the 60-year-old man high up with full cheeks and blondes, a little graying beard, and opposite him the man bent over with age and care, with the unshaven face and deep-set eyes. "I want to beg you most humbly, Mr. Hop," began the old man in a broken voice. "I don't want to know anything. Who told your daughter to hook up with my son? The devil can get her. If I had the power, I would let the dogs bite her to death. Why do you speak so loudly of my child? Your son has the greatest debt after all. He should have known that." "Please speak in a different tone of my son," said Arthur Hop in a menacing tone, the veins swelling on his forehead. That was too much for the old man who had served Hop faithfully for 24 years. His breath flew, he half straightened up and said, his voice taking on a hard note. "What do you say? The poor girls of the people need a little sparkle and beauty as much as anyone else. Is it any wonder, then, that the rich young men succeed very easily in turning her head? Yes, my daughter has loved your son, loved dearly, until she saw that she was being deceived, and she learned the true character of your son. He is the seducer, and instead of me standing here pleading, I had to be the accuser. Only because my child has remained clean and because she has understood that she should not be the victim of a wicked son of rich people, therefore." Arthur Hop did not let the old man finish. No mortal had ever added such a thing to him. "Out!" he yelled, "get out, or I'll take the dog whip." Franz Werner nodded. "I thought it would turn out differently," he murmured to himself. "Now all hope is gone. In the middle of winter and no work." He walked with his head down through the adjoining rooms, a tear rolling down his grey beard. In the waiting room met an elegantly dressed young man. "Well, old man, things didn't go as planned?" said this gentleman with a laugh. Franz Werner made a stupid gesture. "I'll tell you something, Werner," continued the gentleman, "come back in, wait, in 3 days, and then go to work calmly. You're hired again, Werner." The worker looked at the stranger in astonishment, not knowing what to answer. The elegant young man seemed to be guessing the old man's thoughts. "You doubt whether I am entitled to hire you again? Don't worry, everything will work out." The servant entered. "Mr. Hop waits for you, sir." The young man took off his gloves and followed. 5 pairs of eyes focused piercingly on him. He shook hands with the manufacturer. "You have already seen from my card, Mr. Hop," he began, "that I am a detective. The French police send me. I want and must catch Raffles at any cost." Detective Maurice glanced at the detectives. "I see you have made sure that Raffles can be received in a dignified manner. That is good. Very good. But tell me, Inspector." Maurice turned to the man in question, who looked on with a half-convinced, half-distrustful look. "I heard you came here with 4 detectives. Where is the 4th?" Maurice spoke in such a determined tone that Baxter could not refuse an answer. "We've already got Raffles, Monsieur Maurice, at least we're as good as sure. In any case, we have someone who looks just like him and who has suspicious allures." Detective Maurice looked up. "Have you got it already? But Chief, that would be a brilliant success. Let me see that boy." "With pleasure, Monsieur Maurice," replied Baxter, and led the detective into the adjoining room. No sooner had Maurice looked at the prisoner than he cried out in the greatest excitement. "That's him, Mr. Hop, that's him. My hand on it, that's Raffles." Detective Maurice leaned both hands on the writing table just in front of Hop, and while the detectives, who stood around the cupboard, looked the detective in the face and the manufacturer also looked into his eyes, the Frenchman's hand groped over the green cloth of the writing table and slipped into his sleeve the checkbook of the firm Hop and Company, which still contained 5 blank checks, which the manufacturer had already signed for his attorneys at law. "Are you sure it's Raffles? Did you recognize him?" asked Hop. "That would be a great reassurance, for I tremble at my fortune. Where I look, I think I see Raffles." Detective Maurice made a defensive hand movement. "Don't worry, Mr. Hop. It's Raffles. I shall immediately go to the Telegraph Bureau to report this gigantic catch to the Parisian papers. Inspector, you will be the hero of the day, I predict." "Very flattering to me, Monsieur Maurice," replied Baxter, bowing gratefully. Detective Maurice put his left hand in the pocket, held it there for a few moments, took out his watch, and said, "Drums. 4:30. I must hurry to the telegraph office. Excuse me, Mr. Hop. I'll definitely return. I must have the pleasure of visiting you again. Goodbye, Inspector. We will meet again someday." "Too much credit," replied Baxter, delighted at the praise bestowed upon him by his French colleague. Silently the footman opened the gull-wing door for Monsieur Maurice. Baxter looked out the window. "It's not dark enough yet," he said. "We'll wait another half hour." Maurice came back for a moment. "Is it permissible, Mr. Hop," he asked, "that I use your telephone for a moment?" "With pleasure." Maurice went to the writing table, picked up the telephone and called the Palace Hotel. "Is the doorman there?" "Here, Detective Maurice. Would you have my suitcase taken from my room? I'll go back to Paris at 6. Maurice gave thanks with a smile and then hung the microphone on the wrong side of the apparatus, so that it was switched off. Then he went. "A nice fellow," said Hop. "The French are brisk lads, aren't they?" Baxter replied. "But they didn't catch Raffles, did they, Mr. Hop?" Then he looked grimly at the door behind which sat Engineer Einhard, guarded by a detective who never lost his sight for a second. Maurice, meanwhile, had arrived in the street. There he found a young man who was waiting for him. "Oh, are you there already, Charlie? That's right on time. Here you have 4 checks. Fly to the Bank of England, boy, and get the money paid out. Wait, I'll fill out the checks first. 2,000 and 2,000 is 4,500, is £4,500. Wait a minute, Charlie. It's better if you don't go back to the hotel. We'll see each other again tonight at my house. See you later then." Charlie Brand, Lord Lister's secretary, for this and no one else was the detective Maurice, took off his hat and went to collect the checks. Lord Lister, however, went to the nearby telephone office and got himself connected with the Bank of England. "You are talking to the Hop and Company machine shop. Here, Hop. I just wanted to tell you that in 15 minutes some checks will be presented to you for collection. Good day." The elegant young man now took to the streets again. He entered a cafe, had paper and ink brought to him, and wrote the following. "Inspector Baxter. I advise you, dear friend, to release the young man you have arrested at once, if you don't wish to get into any great trouble. Furthermore, I greet you kindly, Chief, and I assure you that tomorrow you will be the hero of London. Thank you very much for your valued assistance in keeping my promise. John C. Raffles." Then he wrote a second letter to Mr. Hop. "Will you convince yourself at the Bank of England that I have already largely fulfilled my promise? I thank you for your concession and hope that we will meet again soon. The money, of which you have far too much, and which I have obtained on the basis of my promise, I will use moderately and thereby pay off a small part of the debt which you have charged to the poor. John C. Raffles." Lord Lister called for a porter, handed him both letters, and looked at his watch. 10 minutes to 5. It takes the man 5 minutes to deliver the letters. 2 minutes later, Baxter is already chasing me, so I have 3 minutes left to fulfill my promise. And Lord Lister lit a cigarette, paid for his coffee, and sauntered slowly to Hop's house. 3 minutes later the servant handed over the 2 letters brought by the porter. Baxter and Hop opened and read the writing at the same time. And at the same time they dropped the paper and looked at each other with indescribable faces. Then Hop stretched out both arms in the air like a drowning man, his face tinged dark red. "That's your fault, Inspector," he roared, and picked up the phone. He turned the crank furiously. "The Bank of England. Do I speak to the bank? Here, Hop and Company, have you got the checks? What, have you already paid? In the name of all living devils, did I command you? How do you get it? What, have you telephoned 7 times? No answer? Ask." Hop threw the microphone on the table, breaking it in half. And at the same time the manufacturer went on a light as large as an electric arc lamp. "He hung up the phone wrong. He stole the checks from me. And all for my eyes. But for the devil, what do you stand here with 4 detectives to guard my safe? Oh, that Raffles. He's driving all London crazy," shouted Hop. Now Baxter threw back his head. "Who's to blame? You yourself, Mr. Hop. Didn't you shake hands with Raffles at once? You have caused us all this misery. But now, too, he is done. His last hour has come. He has surrendered himself into our hands." Baxter flew to the door, pushed it open, and exclaimed, "Set that gentleman free." "Excuse me, Monsieur Engineer. A little misunderstanding. You can thank Raffles. Wherever villainy is committed, Raffles has a hand in the game." Then the inspector turned to the detectives. "Follow me. We must encircle the Palace Hotel on 4 sides. And meanwhile telephone Scotland Yard to have all stations occupied. He will not and may not escape us this time." "I'll join you," said Hop, letting him bring his hat, coat, and stick. "I want to be there when Raffles is arrested. And I want my hard-earned money back." The policeman went out with great noise. After a minute there was no mortal to be seen in the manufacturer's desk. It was 2 minutes before 5, when the same young man who had first introduced himself as Detective Murrays and who had put Baxter in such great distress, opened the main door of the house with a walker and entered. He whistled a tune from the Merry Woe and approached the great safe. Carefully he dropped the curtains on the windows and now began to open the iron hulk. "Ha! New construction," he whispered, "good too." The great factory clock struck 5. The door of the safe flew open. More than £4,000 lay, partly in gold, partly in paper, before Raffles' eyes. "Unfortunately," he muttered, "I could have used the double." He counted out the money on the table, closed the cupboard, and went into the other room, where he hung up the phone. "Palace Hotel, please. Do I speak to Palace Hotel? Is Inspector Baxter there? Yes? Dude. I am prevented. Come back to the hotel. I'm sorry." "What? Where am I now?" "At Hop and Company. Tell Mr. Hop I've kept my promise. It's just 5 o'clock. See you next time." He hung up the broken machine again and went to the secretary's office. Among a heap of papers, which had been stored in a briefcase, he very soon found the written resignation of Franz Werner. He sat down at the desk and wrote the aged workman a letter informing him that the resignation had been withdrawn. "For your long, faithful service in my factory," it said, "I hereby send you a sum of £100, which you may use at your discretion. You can return to service in 4 days. Hop and Company." Raffles took the stamp, printed it under the signature, sealed the letter, and left the office to put this letter on the box. Then he went to his house. Second chapter. In the play club. Raffles stood in his elegantly furnished drawing room and opened some letters, the address of which was, to Count Sulphur. "Isn't it dangerous that you give Count Sulphur as your address everywhere?" asked Charlie Brand. "Why? If there is a danger, dear Charlie, we simply change houses." "Completely true. But if you don't have enough time to get out of the house in time, if you were arrested here, what's all this worry for? If I hid, I would soon be finished. The fact that everyone can find my house makes me untraceable. You know the police always overlook the most obvious." He looked at the clock. "Drums. 10:15. I have to go to the club. In addition, I would like to meet a young man with whom I have a serious word to say. You can go out, Charlie, go where you like and have fun, but before you open the front door, remember to blow the whistle which we have arranged." With these words Count Sulphur scolded. The valet brought in the heavy fur coat, cylinder, and stick. "Is the Earl riding out?" Yes, Jean, my car is coming in a moment. Excellent. The servant helped his lord, bowed deeply and went. Moments later, a car drove up. Bonjour, Charlie, see you soon. Count Selfa drove to the club. There he was greeted with joy. He was one of the first players to always remain calm whether he won or lost fabulous sums. You haven't been here in a long time, Earl, said Francis Porter, a wealthy sportsman. Then he introduced the Earl as a new club member. Dr. Reinhold Marchner. Count Selfa looked into a finely carved, witty and pale face, which spoke of hardship, but also of inner pride. A pair of blue eyes looked at the Earl, but then withdrew beneath the half-closed lashes. Count Selfa glanced at the gaming table. The young doctor sat down again, wrote a note with a feverish hand, and laid it on the table. An IOU. Count Selfa became observant. He crossed his arms over his skirt and looked at Dr. Marchner's partner. He extended his hand to the Count. Will you see you again? Count Selfa narrowed his eyes without answering this question. You win, as I see, Mr. Hop. The person addressed was a young man of about 28 years old. His face was unnaturally pale, his eyes rimmed with great dark circles. The limp, knotted figure testified to night terrors. He lay back, stretched out his legs and said, with a fleeting, mocking look at his vis-à-vis. Yes, Earl, I am winning £600 so far. A nice pocket money for the next month, eh? He clamped his monocle to his eye, let the lower lip hang down a bit, and continued playing. Count Selfa smiled. It was a gloomy, ominous smile. He passed the mirrors, which reflected his beautiful, elastic figure, and went to the sideboard for a glass of sparkling wine. Although he was separated here from the gaming table by two large gull-wing doors, he was able to observe the two players very closely. Dr. Marchner seemed to have lost all self-control, and every moment he was rubbing his pale forehead nervously. And each time he wrote a new IOU for the opposing party. Thus Count Selfa watched until he saw that the two had left the gaming table and disappeared behind a wide doorway into a room where so often dangerous conversations are conducted, which are often unsuccessful. Earl Selfa hastened through the game room and entered a room adjacent to that which the pair had just entered and separated from it by a velvet doorway. A little bit the Count drew one of the velvet curtains to silk. You have played on your parole and know what that means, he heard a hoarse voice say. It was that of Alfred Hop, the rich manufacturer's son. Before him stood, erect, but with bowed head, Dr. Marchner. He nervously stroked his forehead with his hand. It's true. But wouldn't you give me an extra 24 hours, Alfred? You give me great pleasure with that. What are you thinking of? Not even an hour. Gaming debts are honor debts. If you can't afford those £500, why did you play? Because I hoped that luck would also favor me. The young doctor spoke in a tone of despair. The other laughed mockingly. You hoped. Many a friend of mine has already done that. You must have paid those £500 by this time tomorrow or... Of? Dr. Marchner raised the finely carved face. Or you'll see who you're dealing with. I thought you were my friend, Alfred. It was me. But if you do not keep your word, you are a disgrace, and I have no friendship with such people. A long pause followed. I can't even buy myself a revolver that I need, said Marchner tonelessly. Hop produced a small pistol, encased in nickel. Here, if I can help you with that sometimes. Marchner took the weapon, and in Hop's eyes it shone with a devilish glow. The curtain opened, Alfred Hop disappeared. Farewell. Desperately, Marchner sank into the chair, his right hand slowly raised the revolver. There the door in the background was opened. Count Selfa entered. Stop, he said in a commanding tone, unlucky one, are you so tired of your life that you want to destroy it for a trifle? Marchner looked at the Earl with wide eyes. Have you heard everything? Everything. A smile played on the Count's lips. How much do you owe Alfred Hop? £500. But... Count Selfa took out a wallet and pressed 10 banknotes into the young doctor's hand. Here. Enter the gaming room and pay your debt. Why did you play? I ended up in this club. My friend Alfred Hop brought me here. I hoped, to improve destitute condition. Ah, how shall I thank you for this gift? Don't worry. I'll get that money back. Go now? Marchner went to the gaming room. The slender young man, who had been left alone in the hall, now pressed an electric bell. A servant appeared. "Tell Mr. Hop that a gentleman wishes to see him." The footman went, and the Earl turned off half the lights, took out a black mask and tied it over his face. A few moments later Alfred Hop came in. He looked pale with excitement. "Is someone here?" he asked. "Yes. I wanted to speak to you." Hop looked in the face with the black mask and, terrified, wanted to go back. But in the same instant the barrel of a revolver glittered before his eyes. "Don't go a step further, wretch, if your life is dear to you." Hop stood nailed in place. He didn't say a word and his body cringed, as if waiting for a whiplash. "What do you want from me?" he moaned. "Dr. Marchner just paid you £500 there, didn't he? And did you return the IOU to him?" "Of course." "Good. Then put those £500 on the table here." "But that money is mine." "Be silent. Not a word more. Shall I take you to the gaming room and cut the left sleeve out of your skirt? Beware, or I will tell everyone where you have hidden your false cards." Alfred Hop was startled, but he still hesitated. The man in the mask smiled. "I count to 3. Then when the money is not on the table, something terrible happens. 1, 2. But Hop had already quickly put the money on the table, and with a shy look he now asked, "Who are you?" The masked one laughed again. "Go away. I am Raffles." Hop drew back. "Raffles!" he shouted in a voice that sounded 3 halls away, and with a giant leap he disappeared. A few moments later a dozen gentlemen burst into the room. But Raffles had already left the hall, and leisurely, with people looking for him everywhere, he descended the stairs, allowed himself to be given his coat, and left. He had sent his motor car away to make the way home on foot and enjoy the crystal-clear night air. "And I assure you it was Count Sulphur and no one else," shouted Alfred Hop to his friends. "I saw it in the beautiful Indian ring. And in addition, turn the word Sulphur around. Then you get Raffles. Such a deceiver." There was great excitement all around. Everywhere people searched for the Count. He was gone. The lackeys reported that they had seen him leave. "Then Raffles is also Sulphur and Sulphur Raffles," it sounded in unison. Alfred Hop, however, laughed. "No, but it's beautiful," he exclaimed. "I'll call the police right away. The address of this villain is known in our house. Just wait. He'll be behind bars in an hour." And Alfred Hop warned the police, on the solemn assumption that he would very soon have his £500 back in his pocket. Chapter 3. An attachment that failed. One of the detectives took the message. He immediately reported it to Baxter. He ordered that a dozen police officers, led by Detective Marhome, should immediately go to Raffles' house to arrest him when he returned home. Marhome, however, had his own plan. "The great unknown," he said, "is a cursed fellow. You can surround his house 100 times and he escapes again 100 times. I have a plan that will shame my college Sherlock Holmes and turn Baxter yellow with envy." He selected 12 officers in civilian clothes who would line up around Count Sulphur's house. "If I whistle, you will come. When danger threatens, I shoot. Besides, you must wait for my orders," he said. The troops started moving. Marhome jumped on a bicycle and pedaled to the house of the great unknown. It was 1 o'clock after midnight. Everything slept. Marhome chimed, and after a while Count Sulphur's servant opened the door. "Are you Count Sulphur's servant?" "To serve you." "Listen. The Count will be home very soon. I will hide in his bedroom, as I want to personally arrest him. So don't say a word to the Count. To hear? Understand?" "But." "No buts. If you dare warn your lord, you will be there." The servant shrugged. "If it's so dangerous, I'll leave it alone." Marhome looked around. "Regularly furnished," he muttered, "as usual. But where is the best place to hide now?" He looked under the cot. "That's the best opportunity. I'll wait until he goes to sleep. Too bad I can't see his face when I so suddenly lay my hand on his shoulder and say, 'Raffles, you're my prisoner.'" The servant nodded. "Don't you mention Raffles there?" he asked. "That is the great hero, the man who has not yet been found, and for whom I have a boundless reverence." And as he spoke these words, he set a large standing mirror in front of the bedstead in such a way that the soles of the one beneath it were just visible. "They won't be able to see me like that, say?" asked Mahome. "No, Aya." "Beautiful. And remember to shut up." "Naturally." There was swearing. Jean flew away. It was Count Sulphur, who came in accompanied by a strange young man. This, red-bearded and pale-faced, was none other than Dr. Marchner. He had approached Count Sulphur when he approached his residence. "Excuse me, Count, a single word. Art thou Raffles?" The Earl thought for a moment. "If you're so interested in it," he said, "yes, I'm Raffles." "Fly then. I was still in the club when you were gone. You have been recognized. The police have been warned. 12 officers have surrounded the house." Raffles took out his gold cigarette case, offered the doctor one, lit one himself, and looked around with a smile. "Ha! I see several shadows. Don't go any further, Count, you'll be arrested." "Oh, doctor, don't worry. Come along. It's too cold here. Come and have a glass of brandy at Count Sulphur's house. And let's chat and smoke a few cigarettes." Marchner turned deathly pale. "For God's sake," he whispered, "you saved my life. I owe you gratitude, but—" "You'll catch a cold, doctor, if you keep talking," laughed Earl Sulphur, closing the door. Nobody moved. The shadows remained motionless in the niches. There came Jean, the domestic servant. Count Sulphur looked sharply at him. "Nothing happened, Jean?" "Nothing, Count." "No letter come?" "No, Count. I have already set up the mirror so that you can undress at once." Count Sulphur looked again sharply at his servant, and then had his guest enter the drawing room. Before the Count entered, he went to his bedroom. As he always did, he first looked carefully around from under his half-clamped eyelashes. There he saw, in the mirror, 2 dirty soles of shoes. He smiled once and went back to the drawing room, without closing the dividing door, so that he had a wide view of the bedroom. "Make yourself comfortable, doctor," said the Earl, filling 2 glasses from crystal carafes. Dr. Marchner went from one terror to another. He went to the window and looked outside. Count Sulphur joined him. "A beautiful, clear winter night, isn't it, doctor? I sometimes stand here for hours looking at the firmament, and then try to fathom the secrets that hover between heaven and earth, as slowly and monotonously the snowflakes whirl against the window, and all London veils in a veil of crystalline riddles. But you still owe me some clarification, doctor. Excuse me if I ask you a question. I am such a philosopher. How could you thus indulge the ridiculous passion of the game?" "I had already intended, Count, to give you some clarification on that. It still seems to me as if I have lived through a bad dream. But listen to the real cause. I love a poor girl. Yes, dear God, she is poor, more than poor. Magda Werner has loved me too, and thereby made me one of the happiest mortals. I would gladly share all the hardships with her, and especially now, when poverty is so acute in her family. She is a child of the people, Count, but to me she is a princess, for she is noble and good. And in order to provide her with a carefree existence, her whom I love above all else, so the disastrous idea came to me, well, you know the rest." Count Sulphur had smoked his cigarette in silence. He lay now in an American rocking chair, the great, clear, dark eyes raised. Then, suddenly, he jumped up. "Magda Werner, do you say, doctor?" "Yes. Do you know her?" "Her father was 2 days old ago fired from the Arthur Hop factory." So yes. Anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow, doctor." Dr. Marchner went. He was despondent, for he thought he would hear no more from the Earl now. He walked on. But suddenly he stopped. He heard a whistle chirp in the air, and he quickly ran away, heart beating, lest he see his benefactor led away in handcuffs. Meanwhile, Count Sulphur had been swearing. Jean entered. "You can go to sleep, Jean, I don't need you any more." "Very well, Count." Jean bowed and went. Count Sulphur went to his bedroom, turned off the electric light halfway, and sat down in an armchair opposite his bed. "Tell me, friend," he then began, "didn't you see that downstairs it clearly says, 'Wipe feet'? You've made my carpet filthy." No answer. "Tell me, don't you hear, Mahome?" Do you mean me? In a dull tone it came from under the bed. Yes, who else could I mean? But come here anyway, so we can have a nice chat. Mahome crept out. You are my prisoner, he then said to Count Sulphur. This one laughed. Not so soon, Mahome. Have a seat first. You must be exhausted. A glass of brandy? Nothing. How so? I am a total abstainer. And now be serious. You are my prisoner. Come, I don't care much for the gossip of the police. You are my prisoner. And Mahome wanted to go to the window to blow the agreed-upon whistle. But then too suddenly, menacingly, Count Sulphur's tall figure stood before him. Foaming with rage, Mahome took out his rubber stick. At the same moment Raffles struck him in the throat, which he slammed to the ground. However, he jumped elastically to his feet and flew toward Count Sulphur. But what was that? Sulphur's eyes looked at the detective like two great shining stars, and he could not break free from the spell. His hand with the rubber stick fell limply along his body. And as if from afar the words sounded in his ear. Sleep. Everything went black around him. Everything became night. You sleep. Do you know who you are? No, you don't know. Yes, I know. I am, but he got no further. No, you are Raffles. Raffles? Yes, you are Raffles. Who are you? I am Raffles. As? Raffles. Say it again. Raffles. Good. You are Raffles. And you have gone home to sleep, because you are weary. Not true? And Count Sulphur looked at the sleeping man for a moment, and then took out a pencil case. At this moment Jean, who had been constantly peering through the keyhole, stuck his head inside the door. Will I, Count? Do you dare? But of course. Come here then. At your service. And Jean began to lather. Mustache and beard, shave both off, Jean. Then take him off the uniform, lay them out for me and tuck him into bed. Put him on one of my silk nightgowns first. Excellent, Count. And Jean went to work. With the skill of an actor, Raffles now stuck to his face a beard that resembled that which Mahome had worn. It doesn't suit me, but it serves its purpose, muttered Raffles. He put on the helmet and opened the window. A whistle sounded. Fierce spectacle followed. The officers stormed into the semi-dark bedroom from all sides after gaining entry to the house. Chef? Raffles kept his finger to his mouth. Shh. He sleeps. Are you in cuffs? Yes, boss. All right then. Raffles tapped the sleeping man on the nose. Hey, wake up. What is it? You'll see. He. Are you Raffles? Yes, I am Raffles. Hello, boys. And Mahome was dragged out of bed by 12 pairs of hands, wrapped in a blanket, and carried into the carriage already waiting. Raffles, meanwhile, had gone to his bathroom. There he quickly changed his clothes, donned a fur coat, put on a top hat, and left the house. Where's the chief? The officers asked. They looked for Mahome, but when they did not find him they thought he had already made progress. Raffles, meanwhile, had berated Scotland Yard in a telephone office. There Scotland Yard? Here Raffles. What? Yes, here Raffles. I just wanted to inform you that I sent Detective Mahome to you. He was sleeping with me. What? Where am I now? Telephone machine number 17. What? I have no more time. See you later. Then Raffles drove to the Metropole Hotel, where he was to meet Charlie Brand the next day. Chapter 4. The Saviour of the Dice Inherited. Charlie Brand sat opposite Lord Lister in the Metropole Hotel. And where have you been, Charlie? Asked Raffles. Oh, everywhere. I first sauntered about, then heard that the manufacturer Hopp and Baron von Reutz, a friend of these, have a very bad name and a lot on their plate, and then came home. So, well, my dear boy, I am going out again, and under the name of Baron von Reutz. Be careful, Edward. I always am. Baron von Reutz rode to Whitechapel Road and entered one of the great tenements. Very soon he had found what he was looking for, Franz Werner's house. It was a neat, but shabby house. The workman immediately recognized the elegant gentleman. The latter asked for Magda and said that he knew how much Dr. Marchner loved the girl. Werner changed his color. "My daughter," he said, "is not here." "Where is she then?" Reluctantly, the man produced an unpleasant musky note and let it read Baron von Reutz. There stood: "My dear, dear Magda. I must see and speak to you again, dear. Come tonight at 8 o'clock at the familiar place. Call the waiter my name, and he will lead you into a room where we can talk freely. Alfred." The Baron threw the letter aside in disgust. "Is that writing from Boyhop?" "Yes." I begged her not to go there. But she would not for a moment think of any baseness, and went anyway. "I believe, Baron, you were there when old Mr. Hop spoke of my daughter's affair with his son." "Yes, she has allowed herself to be talked down by him all the time. She thought she loved him. It was a small, fleeting dream, as many young girls dream, but she has remained pure. I can put my hand in the fire for her, Baron. Had she been sensible, she would not have committed the carelessness of writing this man a series of letters, pouring out her whole heart to him. He is now taking advantage of those letters. Through those letters he tries to keep her to himself, although she doesn't want to hear anything more from him, because he has a bad character. I'd rather just shoot him. He has threatened her to give those letters to Dr. Marchner. And my child has changed completely since she met Dr. Marchner. She is happy. She has found in him the man she can trust. And now that it will go so well, this wretch intervenes. You understand, Monsieur Baron, what the consequences would be if Dr. Marchner got those letters. However wise and generous he is, he could not understand that she whom he loves should have written such letters to another. It would have been better if my daughter had been honest with him from the beginning, if she'd told him everything, but at first she didn't have the courage, and now, it's too late now." Baron von Reutz had listened to Franz Werner's words with pursed lips. "So? And your daughter apparently hoped that tonight she would get the letters back on which her happiness depends?" "So it is. And I fear he has set her another ambush. She tries the utmost, compromises herself and dares the impossible. Perhaps by this she will ruin everything in a moment, instead of saving her happiness." "We must not think the worst, Herr Werner," replied Baron von Reutz. "I will come to you again in a few days." Franz Werner continued in a whisper. "The day after tomorrow my daughter and Dr. Marchner were to be married. The day after tomorrow already. May I have the pleasure of inviting you to the wedding? I tremble at the thought that something terrible might happen, but hopefully all will be well." "I will come," replied Baron von Reutz, smiling. Then he went down, jumped into his carriage, and called to the coachman. "City." The two horses started moving and at full trot they went forward. Finally the horses stopped. Baron von Reutz got out. Bowing deeply, the waiter approached, and when the Baron mentioned the name Alfred Hop, the waiter answered not a word, but led the young nobleman down a long corridor. Before he could pull aside the heavy curtains that closed the room, however, he felt the guest's hand on his arm. "Wait a second. I wish to occupy the next room." The waiter took the guest according to his desire to the adjoining room. Baron von Reutz gave his further orders, whereupon the waiter left. The young Baron now went out into the corridor again, where he gently and carefully opened the door of the adjoining room. Excited voices rang in his ear. He looked into the small room, magically lit by the red silk shade of a table lamp. On the table were wine glasses and bottles, fruit and pastries. Alfred Hop sat on the divan, while a beautiful young girl stood before him with imploringly outstretched arms. She could not see the entrance to the room, while Alfred Hop also sat with his back to the doorman. With a single inaudible movement, Baron von Reutz had entered the room. His tall, slender frame was sufficiently concealed by the dark background. So he stood motionless. "Is it possible that you can be so cruel?" asked Magda Werner, her large, dark blue eyes brimming with tears. "What good is the letters to you? Why do you torment me so cruelly? Is it a pleasure for you to destroy me and the man who possesses all my heart?" Alfred Hop shrugged brutally and rudely, lifting his pale, withered face and looking at the young girl. "A pleasure? Yes, that is it. Did you really think I had you come here to hand you the letters? I don't think about it. With these letters I have you in my power. And I won't let you go again, think of that. Not right now. I want you to be mine. You've always made me pine for you. Just because I know you don't love me, because someone else will possess you, that's why I demand this sacrifice." The young girl stood speechless before her executioner. Her bosom was panting, and the heavy blonde hair had partially come loose, so that a few long curls hung over her shoulders. Her eyes looked distraught, and in an almost soundless voice she said, "I do not understand you." Alfred Hopp stretched himself on the divan. "Don't you understand me? You will understand me in a moment. You see, there is a special power in me. I myself think that I am a kind of Mephisto, a devil. It is enough for me if I can make someone unhappy. Why should I play the generous to you? Why should I resign myself and give way to another? I don't think about it. When I meet you later in the street, when your cheeks are painted and powdered, and an eternal smile plays upon your lips, you see, I'll have a devilish satisfaction." He looked at her with tight, ruthless eyes. But the young girl did not seem to understand him yet. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and an expression of pride reflected in her eyes. Suddenly Alfred Hopp sprang up. He rushed upon her like a beast of prey, clutched her in his arms, and, as she let out a cry of horror, he exclaimed laughing, "No one hears you here, my dove. Shout as loud as you can. You are in my power." "Not yet," said a deep, melodious male voice. And in the same instant Alfred Hopp, pushed away by a strong hand, flew into a corner of the room. Sobbing and trembling, the young girl rushed to the stranger, who stood in the middle of the room with his tall frame. Alfred Hopp was beyond the first shock. With flaming eyes and clenched fists he stood before the stranger. "Raffles." Panting, he exclaimed the word. The other smiled. "Yes, I'm Raffles." "Miss, villain. Why do you give me the names which you yourself so richly deserve?" replied the great stranger with imperturbable composure, while the young girl looked at him anxiously. "We'll talk more closely, Alfred Hopp. Thou art a devil indeed, but one who lacks the necessary strength. Thou art one of those devils whom one must lay upon an anvil and smash to pieces with an infernal hammer." And without losing sight of the exit for a moment, Raffles took the young girl's cloak from the wall. She understood him and allowed Raffles to wrap herself in the cloak. He gave her a hand, which she wanted to press to her lips with gratitude. He quickly withdrew his hand, however, so that only her burning tears moistened his fingers. "Hurry back home, Miss Werner," said Raffles, gravely. "Take it easy and calm your wedding day, and always remember that Raffles, the great unknown, is watching over you. Stay well, for purity is the only treasure of the poor." Magda Werner looked at him with her large, honest eyes. She nodded, without being able to say a word, then she slid through the door and sped away like a shy bird. Ready for battle, the two men faced each other. "Do you have the letters here?" Raffles asked, arms crossed over his chest. "No. And if I had them here, I would not give them to thee, thou." But Alfred Hopp couldn't finish his sentence. A hard blow to his face made him fall. "Don't need me to chastise you again," said Raffles with the same composure that always characterized him. "The slap I just gave you there was for the insult of a moment ago. But now to the point. Show me the contents of your pockets, to prove that Magda Werner's letters are not here." Alfred Hopp rose and looked with secret terror at the man who had him under his grasp with a single movement of the hand. He obeyed Raffles' orders. It was true, he had kept the letters in a cupboard at home. He had only one with him, which Raffles took from him. "You will give me the other letters too, Alfred Hopp?" "Never." "Yes. But why do you cry so? The waiter can't hear you. Thou shalt give me the letters." Raffles, foretell it. "Other than that, I have nothing to discuss with you for the time being." Raffles prepared to leave. In a mocking tone, Alfred Hopp asked, "And when do you think I should hand you those letters?" Raffles thought for a second. "The day after tomorrow. On the day of Magda Werner's wedding." "Are you coming to the wedding?" "Doubtless." Alfred Hopp pressed his lips together, and a devilish look appeared on his face. Raffles buttoned up his fur and left the room. Chapter 5. Raffles captured. Dr. Marchner celebrated his wedding in a neat suburban restaurant. All anxieties and sorrows seemed to have been banished from the white forehead of the man, who felt profoundly happy in the midst of his friends who had come to celebrate this joyful day. As Dr. Marchner was in the finest circles of London, a distinguished company had gathered around him. No one would have suspected that Magda, Dr. Marchner's happy young wife, came from a working-class family. Her natural grace and gracefully made up for what she might lack in development. When she smiled, everyone was delighted with her, not least of all Marchner himself. Only now and then a cloud passed over his forehead, then his eyes wandered expectantly through the window to the station. Apparently he was expecting another guest. Though he had told his young wife nothing of the adventure with the great unknown, she, too, did not seem quite calm. Suddenly Dr. Marchner sprang up. A tall, slender, elegant young man approached from the side of the station. The snow crunched beneath his springy steps. A beautiful fur coat enveloped his slender figure. The impeccable cylinder made the young man appear even taller than he was, and matched perfectly with the somewhat pale, distinguished, finely cut face with the thin lips and large, clear eyes. The new arrival immediately attracted general interest. Dr. Marchner had already rushed to meet him. "I am glad that you are coming," he exclaimed. "I had been waiting for you." "Ah, you cannot understand what I have felt since I last left your house, sir." "Baron von Reutz," replied the new guest, laughing. Dr. Marchner hastened to introduce the young man to those present by that name. Within minutes the young nobleman was the center of the conversation. The party went on in the most merry way. Evening approached, and already they were preparing to return to London. Suddenly the door was opened and a young man entered, well known to several of those present. It was Alfred Hopp. There was a devilish glow in his eyes. His right hand held a bundle of papers. With this he approached the happy bridegroom, and offering him the papers he said, "Dr. Marchner, I am giving you these letters as a wedding present." A breathless silence ensued. Everyone understood that something special was happening here. The young woman had jumped up. Her cheeks had turned deathly white. She looked with anxious eyes at her husband, who rose slowly and stretched out his hand for the letters. At the same instant, however, another fist intervened, so swiftly and firmly that Alfred Hopp could not have withdrawn the letters. Baron von Reutz stood with his head held high between the two men. The letters disappeared in one of his coat pockets. "That is unheard of insolence," exclaimed the rich manufacturer's son, frothing with rage. "How have you the courage to take those papers from me? They are for Dr. Marchner." "I think you are mistaken," replied Baron von Reutz, crossing his arms over his chest and looking at the boy's whimsy with a withering look. "No, I am not mistaken," roared Alfred Hopp. "Gentlemen, I call upon you as witnesses. This wretch has stolen my papers from me." "A small chastisement is due you for this lie," replied the nobleman, and he slapped the savage across the face so that he tumbled backwards. "You will pay for that," shouted this one. "Lord, this wretch, who presumed to act in such a manner, is—" Everyone listened in eager anticipation. Baron von Reutz did not move a muscle from his face. But Alfred Hopp did not utter the word that lay on his lips. His face twisted more and he bid the Baron, "No, it is still too early. But if you think you can prevent me from carrying out my plan, you are mistaken. Dr. Marchner, I claim I have older rights over Mrs. Magda than you. Thou hast married my beloved, in the papers which Baron von Reutz has taken from me as the proof." The effect of these words was terrible. Dr. Marchner had turned deathly white, his hands trembled, and trembling he turned to his young man wife, fixing his eyes menacingly and at the same time questioningly. The young woman was silent. She wanted to answer, but her tongue was paralyzed. Sobbing, she fell down in her chair, so that it was not clear whether guilt or grief at the great insult inflicted upon her crushed the unfortunate one. Now, however, something unexpected happened. Baron von Reutz stepped forward and spoke, turning to Dr. Marchner. "I claim that this rascal has now lied for the second time. His only concern is to rob you of your young happiness. His poisoned, wicked soul knows how to occupy itself with no better things than to take revenge on virtue and purity. To prove to you, dear doctor, that he lied, I hereby hand you the papers which I took from him." Baron von Reutz took the packet of letters from his pocket and handed it to the young doctor. The young woman, who had looked up with hope at the Baron's first words, paled again. Alfred Hopp enjoyed. Franz Werner, still sitting at the table, bent his head over his plate. "Drive, Marchner," however, took the letters and opened the package. He flew through the first, the second, the third, his countenance brightened, and at last he turned to his young wife, seized both her hands, and said in a low tone, "Forgive me, Magda, forgive me if I dared doubt you even for a moment. But thou, wretched rascal," he said to Hop, who receded in terror, "thou shalt account to me an insult more than brazen. If you are not insane, you are like a murderer, for you are doing your best to deprive others of their happiness and honor." For a moment Alfred Hop was unable to answer. However, the other wedding guests, indignant about what had happened, put the disturber of the peace on the street with united forces. Baron von Reutz said goodbye. He bent deeply over the young woman's hand and raised it to his lips. She looked at him with moist eyes and whispered, "How can I ever thank you enough?" He smiled. "By always being good, madam. There are so few people of whom one can say that." He shook hands with the young doctor in silence. Then he took his hat, opened the door, and turned toward the station. Suddenly Franz Werner stood in front of him. "Forgive me for holding you up for a moment. It doesn't come in handy, I know that. I am but a workman too, and do not know in what words I shall express my great thanks. But you understand me, don't you?" Baron von Reutz squeezed Werner's hand. "I understand you. Farewell." "One more thing, Lord Baron. How did you set that up? After all, they were the letters of my daughter, which the wretch wanted to give to my son-in-law." The young nobleman smiled. "Secure. But there are circumstances in life in which one must use a magic trick to achieve good, Mr. Werner. That is a sad truth, but it has become my motto. I took one of those letters from the young man the day before yesterday. He thought he was smarter than I was, and I understood that he would seek this moment to destroy young Mrs. Magda's happiness forever. That is why I prepared a dozen such letters last night, which looked like those in his possession. On those letters, while forging Magda's hand, I wrote a few meaningless poems. I put in it several times the name of Dr. Marchner, so that he could at most apply them to himself. This was the only means of ridiculing the brazen accusation of that scoundrel." Franz Werner seized the speaker's right hand with both hands. "Thou art a benefactor of mankind." Baron von Reutz smiled. It was a wistful smile. "Maybe, maybe not, Mr. Werner." He took a package from one of his pockets and handed it to the old man. It contained Magda's real letters. "Keep them, Mr. Werner, and if Magda should ever forget the trials she has gone through, should she ever stumble in life, show her these letters, and she will get back on the right track." At these words the young noble turned and with swift strides he made his way to the station. Franz Werner watched him in silence until the tall, slender figure had disappeared into the darkness of night. When he reached the station, Baron von Reutz looked around inquiringly. "I'm surprised the police aren't here yet," he muttered. "My friend Hop seems to have come up with a very special plan." He stood thoughtful for a few moments, then turned to a first-class compartment. At the same time, under the tall trees that surrounded the station building, two men stood together. One of them was Alfred Hop, the other was a young man, who looked like a mean chap, and who no doubt did not fit into the fine clothes he wore. Though he was of slender stature, he did not have the demeanor of a man accustomed to moving around in good circles. New glazes covered his large hands, on the square head with sharp, angular lines and in which a pair of piercing, squinting eyes glittered. He wore a grey, elegant felt hat. "So you know what I promised you, Fritz, do your business well," said Hop. The other laughed cheekily. "You can trust me. In this part of London there is no one to correct me." Alfred Hop nodded. "You wait for me at the appointed place tomorrow evening, then I'll bring you the money. And don't forget one thing. Somewhere before Hyde Park you jump off. Baxter rides the same train with 5 police officers. They outsmart Raffles. Do your job well." The person whom Hop had addressed by the name Fritz laughed with a broad grin and disappeared. He was a notorious burglar, perhaps worse, a chap whom young Hop had already used several times to incapacitate for some time troublesome men. This time, however, things were much more serious. Fritz had pressed his hat far over his forehead and, with his head slightly bent over and his eyes squinting, crept past the railway cars, looking into each compartment. Raffles suddenly saw a pair of bloodthirsty, hateful eyes peering in. Then the door was opened and a man of very doubtful appearance stepped in. Half a minute later the train started moving. Panting, he steamed through the snow-covered forest that lay before them as if in a cloak of snow. Raffles leaned back into the cushions. A nice smile played on his lips. Slowly he closed his eyes. About 10 minutes passed. Then he seemed to be asleep. But he didn't sleep. Through the almost closed eyelids he watched every movement of his mysterious traveling companion. Apparently he hadn't paid attention to him at first. Now however, when he perceived that the other was asleep, he approached the window. For a few moments he stood there, looking at the snow-covered forest. With a hasty movement he pressed his hat even deeper over his forehead, then turned to Raffles. The sleeping traveler's chest rose and fell regularly. With a quick movement Fritz now turned off the light in the top of the compartment, and a few minutes later he jumped out of the car so hastily that he rolled off the embankment with some wounds at the head, until at last he could only stand up with difficulty. "And are you quite sure that it is really Raffles who is in the train?" Baxter asked for the third time already the boy Hop, who was in the same compartment with him. He had received a telephone message that Raffles, the great unknown, was leaving N2B, would travel. The captain had just arrived to ride with his officers in the departing train. Hop replied, "You may call me the greatest donkey in all London, sir, if this time I don't hand you over Raffles in skin and hair." The other nodded. "I never hated anyone so much in my life as this Raffles," he said, passing his hand over his forehead. "That guy is driving me to despair. I'm going to go crazy this way. Everywhere you go you hear about Raffles. It's about going crazy. But now, let the devil get me, if the affair does not end now." "I hope so with all my heart," Alfred Hop answered honestly. At each station where the train stopped, the officers left the carriage. Baxter had decided to wait for the train to reach Station B, where he would briefly arrest Raffles and take him to jail. Raffles really didn't get out of anything. Finally the train had reached the end Station B. At a trot, Baxter, panting with exertion, raced past the wagons, followed by the skinny Hop. Baxter opened the door of the compartment in which Raffles was seated and looked inside. For a moment he stood nailed to the footboard. Then he climbed in, where the others followed him, and, fading, he exclaimed, "What happened here? Is the whole world upside down?" "But help me," pleaded an old gentleman in the compartment. "Do you not see that I am bound hand and foot?" He who spoke these words was an old man of about 65 years of age. He was indeed bound hand and foot, and spoke in a hoarse voice with emotion. He looked up at the officers with dull eyes. "Quick, quick!" he cried in a plaintive tone. "My wallet! Don't stand here unemployed. £3,000 have been stolen from me." "But who did that?" Inspector Baxter asked in a surprised tone. "Who?" moaned the old gentleman. "Are you also asking who?" "Raffles. Raffles has ambushed and robbed me." Young Hop, too, was speechless. He feared that he would be called to account by the inspector, and as he disliked unpleasantness, he hurried off. Meanwhile, Baxter listened to the old gentleman's announcements, who indicated in detail the direction Raffles had fled. The thief was immediately hunted. Police stations in the London area were notified by phone, and Baxter made himself comfortable with his men ready to overtake the fugitive, while the old gentleman gave his address and drove to his hotel. At 10 o'clock in the evening Raffles was captured. He had made desperate attempts to escape, but he was surrounded on all sides and could not save himself. A short, desperate struggle ensued, but the end of it was that Raffles, who had still tried to make himself unrecognizable by disguise, was taken to the London jail. The next day Raffles' name echoed through the streets of London. Raffles captured, the reports said, Raffles in prison, Raffles denies, Raffles claims to be someone else, but he won't say who. Raffles claims he's a Frenchman, and that he was carrying papers in the name of Lord Lister as Raffles. Thus was the loud shouting at every corner of the streets where peddlers stood. They fought for the newspapers. They devoured the contents, the details of the arrest of Raffles and his last trick, the robbery of a traveler. It was really useless trouble for Raffles to deny everything. The amount which he had stolen from the traveler had been found in his possession. Inspector Baxter himself handed the money to the robbed Raffles, realizing at last that he was lost, confessed that he really was the great unknown. The case was to be heard in 2 months. But on the second day after Raffles's arrest, something unexpected happened. The judge of inquiry, who presided over the case, was called by telephone that day. "Is it you, Monsieur Instructional Judge?" "Yes. I have heard that you are constantly taunting Raffles. Do you know this Raffles personally?" "Yes." The judge of instruction, surprised and furious at the same time that someone dared to disturb him during his working hours, answered over the telephone. "Certainly I know Raffles. He works enough for me with all his tricks, and I don't think he's nearly as handsome and elegant as he's always been described." "So?" It sounded mockingly. "Well, I've heard something different about it. When will the case be heard?" "In 2 months. Adieu." "Just a moment, sir. Raffles will not be present at that treatment." "So? I'll make sure he's there, dear sir." "And I assure you he will not be present." "How can you know that so accurately? Do you want to fool me?" "Not at all. I have too much respect for you. But I repeat, Raffles will not appear." Now the conversation began to bore the judge of instruction. He called off. 2 minutes later, the warden of the prison where Raffles was incarcerated entered him. "Just a moment, Sir Judge of Inquiry. I just received a letter there, in which Raffles informs me that he will under no circumstances be present at the hearing of his case." "What?" exclaimed the other. "Oh come," he continued, after a moment's thought, "some impudent flounder is making fun of us." The prison warden shrugged. "I thought so too. But the unfortunate thing is that we have decided that this letter must have been undisputedly written by Raffles himself." "But dear director, that is impossible after all. Raffles is in prison with you. Thou shalt surely thyself know best if he can write a letter in his cell and mail it. Is that possible?" "I've said the same thing to myself 100 times. But I can't shake that thought. 3 times they have called me and each time they claimed that it was Raffles to whom he spoke. I'm nervous about it and can't keep my thoughts together. That Raffles." The director was disturbed by the loud yelling of a newspaper boy, who shouted under the window. "A new region of Raffles. Raffles as a burglar while in prison. Raffles, the wizard. A theft of 2 million from the house of Isaac Robinstein." The 2 gentlemen looked at each other with deathly pale faces. At the same instant the door was opened and the state attorney entered. "Of course the newspapers already know. I have just come from the Villa Robinstein, gentlemen. 2 million was stolen there. The thief has entered in the most masterful way. He destroyed the safe and stole 2 million. If I didn't know Robinstein as an unscrupulous loan shark, I should feel sorry for him. Sir Judge of Inquiry, what do you say to this letter?" The lawyer threw a piece of paper on the table. It said, "I take the liberty of informing you that I have taken up the job of criminal judge, because no competent authority has hitherto bothered to take measures against the shameful practices of the wealthy Isaac Robinstein in this town. I will use the money for the poor, whose creditor he is. I would like to publish many more interesting details which I have learned from Robinstein's private correspondence, but I lack the time, for in 15 minutes I must be back in my cell. John C. Raffles." The examining magistrate slapped his hand on the table, causing the paper to jump in height. "Incredible. I'm going mad. Oh, that Raffles. I wish he turned into a pillar of salt. It's to go crazy." The director of the prison clenched his fists. "I can assure you that Raffles is in prison," he said, gritting his teeth, "that the watch makes the rounds every 2 hours, and that it is one of the greatest impossibility that he should have left his cell for even a single moment." "I should think of fraud," said the state attorney in a profound tone, "if the burglary at Robinstein had not been so brilliantly conceived. That was the work of Raffles. And this letter cannot come from anyone else." "I'm going insane," exclaimed the judge of inquiry. At this he telephoned and ordered the entering servant to bring Raffles in. 10 minutes later Raffles was brought in. The 3 gentlemen looked at him with eyes full of anger, but at the same time with veiled admiration. "Do you have any relation to the outside world, Raffles?" asked the judge of instruction. Raffles shook his head. "No, Your Honor." "Will you at last stop fooling us any longer?" "I don't think, Your Honor, to make fun of you." The examining magistrate opened a cigar box and looked at the accused with narrowed eyes. Sit down, Raffles. Would you like to light a cigar? Real Havanas. You are used to a good cigar, Raffles. Listen up. Do you want any favors? There will probably be nothing against your having a glass of wine now and then. After all, you are still only in custody until now. But tell me for heaven's sake, what's going on in London? Raffles slowly lit a cigar, blew clouds of smoke to the ceiling, and said, I've smoked better cigars, Your Honor. I have no objection to the wine. I don't intend to answer any of your questions for the rest. Dude, are you mad? I want to know what that burglary at Robinstein means. At Robinstein? I have been, Your Honor. And you are in your cell? I was taken from my cell, Your Honor. The judge sprang up and called to the jailer. Take Raffles away. He may not have the cigars and the wine. After Raffles was led away, the judge said, What now, gentlemen? Yes, what now? At this moment the telephone rang. Here, Judge of Instruction. Who there? Who? Raffles? Great heaven. Meanwhile a voice rang through the telephone. Why do I have to go back to my cell, Your Honor? After all, such an interrogation does not have the slightest value. Finally leave me alone. I will not appear at the public hearing. Where are you actually calling from? At the sub-post office No. 29, Your Honor. But I'll be gone by the time the police come. And are you Raffles? I am Raffles, on my word of honor. Adieu. The judge of inquiry hung up the telephone and informed the two gentlemen of the content of the conversation. I'm going insane. So he ended as usual. The director of the prison, however, said, There's only one thing left for us. I'll have Raffles guarded in his cell. I will have a second guard patrol the cell day and night. You, Sir Judge of Instruction, will surely see to it that the prison is surrounded by sufficient police force. Even if we fail to figure out the mystery in this matter, we must in any case prevent Raffles from breaking out. This plan was approved. The three gentlemen discussed everything at length once more, then the lawyer returned to his office, the director returned to the prison. In the street he was held up by a great crowd. He leaned out the window of his carriage and asked, What happened here? They've just seen Raffles here, cried a man, but he's gone already. May the devil gather you all together, grumbled the warden, as he withdrew back into the carriage. If it goes on like this, all London will go mad. Chapter 6. A Great Region. The state attorney was of the most feared lawyers in London. His eloquence surpassed anything ever heard in English courts, his logic was sharp, but it was a pity that his abilities were accompanied by a great deal of self-righteousness. It was rare for an accused, who fell into the hands of the state attorney, to leave the courthouse again at large, whether he was guilty or innocent. Rarely did a defender succeed in destroying the fine net which the prosecutor managed to stretch. The trial of Raffles, the great unknown, was approaching. Only 2 more days had to elapse, and all of London waited tensely. The ladies and gentlemen of the leading circles fought for the tickets, for it was a sensational affair such as London seldom experienced. The state attorney was single. His enormous wealth made him completely independent. He owned an almost palatial house in Regent Park. It was decorated entirely according to his own taste. Gloomy and grey it looked outwardly, and inwardly too it was gloomy, antique, and without any modern finery or opulence. It was 12 o'clock in the morning when the lawyer went up the stairs of his house. He already sent his servant into the corridor, for he still wanted to work and did not wish to be disturbed. He took a seat at the table in his study and took out a voluminous bundle of records, which read in thick, round letters, Raffles. Below it was, charged with theft, burglary, deprivation of liberty, insulting officials, mocking authorities, violating city ordinances, regarding driving a bicycle or car, etc., etc. in more than 39 cases. The lawyer bent over the deeds and put down the public indictment, a combination of logical thoughts and inferences, in which Raffles had to get entangled, with no way out. There was dead silence in the room as the lawyer wrote. Only now and then it creaked in one of the old oak furniture. In silence the paintings looked down from their frames at the late worker. The lawyer turned the sheet of paper over, but with a suppressed cry he sprang up. This page has already been described. He didn't trust his eyes. Again he bent over the leaf, put on his lorgnette, But it didn't change. This sheet has already been described. In a feverish haste he turned to the previous pages. He was sure how much he had written. He was sure that the following pages were still blank. I'm excited. He spoke to himself. That's from the alcohol. Then he took his watch in his hand and followed 3 times the slow circle of the second hand. But I am quite sober after all, he exclaimed angrily. And this leaf is still written. It was his own writing. So he was insane or? Yes, was there another option? But was he to believe that he was mad? No. Such a case had never occurred in his family. And that this had come so suddenly, no. No. He bent over the paper, remembering that he had not yet read what was written on the paper. In the small, scribbled script, which matched his peculiar character, it read, "No doubt I shall not remember writing these lines, for my mood changes every hour. But so much is certain that I must somehow find a way to make clear to myself what is truth, and what I have grasped in a clear instant. Raffles is innocent. Raffles is completely innocent. I will repeat these words until I finally believe them, for it would be infinitely unjust to condemn Raffles. Furthermore, at this moment I command myself not to move from my seat, not to take my hand from the paper, not for a moment to try to get up or reach for a revolver, but dead still, as if under the influence of personal magnetism, to stay put. And then I command myself to raise my head slowly and fix my eye on the large oil portrait of Chamberlain which hangs opposite me." The lawyer forgot to shut his mouth. Slowly, very slowly he lifted his head and looked at the portrait hanging directly in front of him, and a feeling of paralysis took over him. The lawyer let out a cry of surprise and shock. He turned his head, and then looked again at the picture that hung in its heavy oak frame on the dark wall, and again he let out a half-suppressed scream. Chamberlain's head was alive, it moved its eyes, it looked at him with a threatening look. A smile that did not suit that face played on the face, a cheeky smile, which now so true turned into a loud, unforced laugh, and now, truly, now the whole figure emerged from the frame and approached the lawyer. Now, however, he had regained his self-control. He sprang up beside himself with anger and cried, "Mirror! How darest thou to play with me thus? Who are you?" The other smiled, ran his white, well-groomed hand over his impeccable skirt, and replied, "Raffles." Destroyed, broken, sighing, the lawyer sank back into his chair. "Raffles," he repeated. "Raffles. Raffles and always Raffles. But art thou the devil himself? How come you here?" "By the usual way, sir, along the stairs and through the door. Unfortunately, I was forced to use a false key." The lawyer looked at the uninvited visitor. Indeed, it was the same person who was locked up in the prison cell. His hand reached for the phone, but Raffles prevented it with lightning speed. "No alarm, sir. I understand that my visit surprises you. But I don't want to bother you any longer. I should have left your house before you got home, but you happened to show up 10 minutes earlier than I had calculated." "Have you been here longer?" asked the lawyer, while his arm slid very, very slowly, so that Raffles could not possibly notice it, down into the drawer in which the revolver lay. "Will you allow me to take a seat? I suspect you will have several questions to ask me." And Raffles sat down, took out his cigarette case, presented it to the lawyer, and asked, "Can I serve you? Excellent cigarettes. Imported straight from Constantinople." The lawyer raised his hand in a dismissive gesture. "Thank you. I don't smoke cigarettes." Raffles smiled, struck a match, and moments later he blew fine, blue, fragrant clouds of smoke. At the same moment a drawer was forced open, and the lawyer stood with his head erect like a god of vengeance before the intruder, before whom he held out a 6-barreled revolver. "Get on your knees, wretch. The game is over, thou art in my power." But Raffles remained calm. He stretched out his long legs still further, blew the cigarette smoke comfortably into the air, raised his eyebrows, and asked, "Why are you getting so worked up? And why is it necessary that I kneel? That is at odds with my principles. If you are so inhospitable, I'd rather leave your house." "No, you will not." "Not? I thought you would like to get rid of me. I have the time, however." "No kidding, please. If you don't raise your arms in 3 seconds, I'll put a bullet through your brain." "But that would be murder after all. After all, you are not in mortal danger. Think what a terrible charge you would have to bring against yourself. You wouldn't want to shoot an innocent man like I am, would you? The lawyer didn't think about shooting Raffles. He only wanted to put a bullet through the right arm so that he could no longer defend himself. So when his last order was not obeyed, the lawyer got up to call his servant. "Do not bother," said Raffles. "I turned off the bell." "For heaven's sake, do you think of everything?" "Yes, to everything, sir." But now the distinguished official had had enough of being fooled. He grabbed the intruder furiously and tried to throw him to the floor. Was it just a coincidence, though, or did Raffles possess extraordinary strength and agility? Instead of Raffles, the attacker himself fell to the carpet. In the next moment, however, the lawyer faced Raffles again, raised his revolver, and held it before his opponent's eyes with outstretched arm. "Get on your knees or I shoot, let what will come of it." "I already told you that I do not kneel," replied Raffles in a tone of indifference. "Why? I don't intend to get my trousers dusty." "I shoot." "Don't worry, sir. After all, that thing doesn't fire." "You are mistaken. I loaded the revolver myself." "Quite possible. But I got the cartridges out again." The lawyer pressed. Indeed, the revolver was not loaded. Trembling with rage, she sank back into his chair, and with twinkling eyes he looked at the man who played his dangerous game with all who crossed his path. "Now you will see, sir, that it is the wisest party to let me go again." Raffles looked at his watch. "I must be back in jail in half an hour, sir, so I must deny myself the pleasure of keeping you company." Raffles produced a revolver. "This one is loaded. I beg you in no way make it difficult for me to leave your house, otherwise I would be forced to fire. Farewell and think of me again. By the way, I'm not coming to the trial, Your Honor." The lawyer replied. "What if I asked you kindly, Raffles? After all, you have such extraordinary courage. Are you afraid to appear?" Raffles smiled. "Not at all. If it pleases you." "Certainly, Raffles. So you're coming?" "With pleasure. Since you like it so much, Mr. Advocate, I'll do you that pleasure." "On your word?" "On my word of honor." The lawyer nodded. "Farewell." Raffles bowed politely, courteous like a true gentleman, and went to the door. Despite the extorted promise, the lawyer liked to rush after him, but Raffles always kept his revolver ready. Only after closing the door behind him did he put the dangerous weapon back in his hand, muttering, "Which a cigarette cutter isn't good for." And with slow steps he descended the stairs. The lawyer waited a few moments, then rushed to the door to call his servant. But the door was locked. He searched furiously for the key, but Raffles had apparently made sure that it was locked on the outside, and had closed the door when he left. Then the young lawyer went to the phone to call the nearby police station, but there was no trace of Raffles before anyone came. He did, however, make the unpleasant discovery that Raffles had taken £500 from his safe. In the place where the packet of bills had been, he found a note of the following contents. "The defenders charge a large fee these days, sir. And because I need a good lawyer, I take the liberty of paying it out of your money, for you yourself force me to hire a lawyer. It is therefore only fair that you yourself should pay my defender." The lawyer was crushed. Raffles made his way back to the Metropole Hotel. Charlie Brand was already waiting for him with great impatience. Finally, Charlie called to him. "I'm terribly worried about you. As long as this adventure ends well." Raffles stripped off his fur, sat down in the spacious armchair, and said, "It will end as well as so many others, Charlie." "All the papers are full of your incomprehensible conduct," said Charlie after a while. "Tell me how it is possible that the police think you are in prison, while at the same time you are making visits to the officials themselves." "Oh, that depends on a trifle," replied Raffles, laughing. "I told you, after all, that on my journey to London I was ambushed by some fellow. At first I intended to give that fellow his freedom again, but I have found that he has no less than 3 murders on his conscience. So I will not withhold his just punishment from him. But to the point. That fellow came upon me when he thought I was asleep. He gave me a blow to the brain that left me dizzy for a few seconds. However, I pretended to be unconscious. The fellow then took everything I had with me, my money, my papers, which were in Lord Leicester's name, well, everything. He then took a knife and wanted to slit my throat. You understand, my boy, that I no longer kept myself unconscious then. I have nothing to do with such things. I therefore sprang up suddenly, struck his already raised arm, and gave the villain such a mighty kick that he flew like a log against the door of the compartment, which was apparently so badly closed that it flew open and the guy rolled headlong off the railway embankment. My plan was immediately established. I knew that there was a police force on the train and that they wanted to arrest me at the station in London. So I had to see to it that the latter could not succeed them, and I also wanted my money back, which the villain had stolen from me. You know, dear Charlie, I have a means of making myself totally unknowable. I rarely use it, because it always takes a few days before I have erased the effect of the remedy by means of warm baths, massage, etc. It is a corrosive liquid that dries the skin like parchment and contracts into wrinkles. If I wanted to escape the danger, I had to use this remedy now. Since I always have a beard with me, I was able to turn myself into a 70-year-old old man within 5 minutes. With my hair dye comb I completed the disguise. I brushed it through my hair, which instantly turned snow white. Thereupon I handcuffed myself and handed myself over to the police, who, for their part, had the goodness to return the stolen money to me and to take the runaway bandit for Raffles, although it takes much imagination to establish any resemblance between us to discover both. However, the fellow was in possession of my papers and of course the police did not think that they could also have been stolen. The criminal has every reason to hide his identity, because then he would undoubtedly be on the scaffold. He therefore much prefers to pass for Raffles, and so he has succeeded to this very moment in continuing the deception. The prisoner need only confess everything I do. Had the police ever questioned the so-called Raffles, the whole deception would have been exposed. Of course lately I have kept a constant eye on the prison, and for instance, 2 minutes after the pseudo-Raffles had been questioned by the judge of inquiry, I was able to telephone the gentleman and inform him that it was useless to bother me all the time. I had seen the prison wagon drive up and happened to convince myself that the false Raffles had just been returned from an interrogation. "And what is to be done now, dear friend?" asked Charlie, who had listened to the speaker with admiration. "We'll pay our bill here first, Charlie, for we'll have to change houses again. And on that, I'll be going to visit my attorney Newman tomorrow." "You mean that Dr. Newman who has taken on the defense of the pretended Raffles?" "Yes. It is necessary that I inform him of a few details." "And then?" Raffles leaned back comfortably in his chair and smiled at his friend. He then informed him of a new plan, in which story Charlie Brown joined hands above his head in comic despair. 2 days had passed. The great courtroom in the Palace of Justice was overcrowded. The prosecutor was more nervous than he was used to. When the defendant was brought in, a general murmur was heard. The distinguished ladies and gentlemen who attended the discourse shared their remarks, whispered to each other what impression the great unknown made upon them. In general, people were disappointed. They had imagined him to be much more elegant, taller, handsomer. He also seemed to have already suffered from prison life. His gait was more or less dragging, and when he answered the chairman's first questions, many in the audience were seen to shrug their shoulders. "He speaks like a real plebeian," one thought. "Have you seen his hands?" a young lady asked. "He has hands like a butcher. And his eyes. I would never fall in love with that." Other ladies protested. They found Raffles charming, delightful. Yes, some of her turned pale and red as they looked at him, and a lady in her 20s and 50s fell from delight to impotence. Raffles' defender had taken a seat in the lawyer's bench. On the first 3 days of the session, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Raffles defended himself very clumsily, became confused by the many trick questions put to him, often contradicted himself. In short, no one doubted that he would be sentenced to at least 20 years. They were not interested in him. On the 4th day the pleaders were given the floor. The prosecutor had stood up. The speech he delivered was most certainly a masterpiece of eloquence. The words flowed from his lips like a stream. The whole indictment was put together like a solid building, not missing a single stone. It was a fiery, persuasive speech, but every sentence and every word had been carefully considered. A sigh went through the crowd as the prosecutor fell silent. He had demanded 20 years. And he will get it, was the public opinion. Now Dr. Newman, Raffles's defender, arose. "Your lords, that's how he started. I must make a plea for you today, which will arouse the greatest amazement. This is a long series of criminal acts committed by my client. I will not go into the matter itself, I only want to point out the motives and intentions that moved my brilliant client to act as he did. Raffles is without a doubt a genius. Even the prosecutor has acknowledged that. Raffles has never, not once, used the sums of money he appropriated for himself. Raffles is not a thief, as the prosecutor calls it. Raffles is not a burglar, nor is Raffles, according to human opinion, even obliged to appear here as a defendant, to be judged and punished by his fellow men. On the contrary, society owes a great debt of gratitude to this man of genius, for it is he who endeavors to make some amends for the wrongs that exist in our unjust, depraved society. Raffles has dried countless tears. He has saved the unfortunate from death by providing them with timely help. Raffles has at the last moment reached out to girls and women who were already on the brink of the abyss. The capitalists have no trouble being just and keeping their daughters from shame. But those who are wretched and poor, who have no bread to satisfy their hunger, who cannot enjoy sunshine and fresh air, they have no protector or counselor, only enemies ready to lead them into the abyss and to bring ruin, by means of the advantages connected with the possession of their capital. Raffles has understood that the daughters of poverty need a protector, but he has also understood that the poor are entitled to a share of the enormous capital that accumulates in the hands of a few. Raffles has understood that the unfortunate, the downtrodden, the disinherited, who are weighed down by injustice and must bear their wretched lot, may claim help and salvation. And seeing that none of those who call themselves the righteous cared the fate of those poor and wretched, therefore he came to comfort the weeping, to rescue the desperate, to bring the sorrowful sunshine, the falling and to show those cruelly rejected by society the way to justice. Raffles should have had innumerable millions if he had wanted to fight all the boundless suffering that can be eliminated by his own means. Raffles did not possess this ability. But this wealth is owed to the poor and unfortunate who have only learned the bright side of life. And this power Raffles wants to give back to those who suffer. He lavishly scatters the money among those who need it, and society owes the greatest thanks to this rare man, who has just been so sharply condemned by the public prosecutor. Isn't it happy that Raffles has exposed Arthur Hop's villainy? The misdeeds of the man who has always been regarded as one of the pillars of society? Arthur Hop was captured yesterday. He and his son have made themselves impossible for human society. That's Raffles's job, not a bad job indeed. The £50,000 that Raffles took from Mr. Hop had stolen it from the poor. And who did Raffles give them to? To the poor. And precisely because this man has never done anything out of self-interest, because he has returned to the poor what had been wrongfully taken from them, I demand the acquittal of Raffles in absentia. In breathless suspense, jurors and public had listened. When the lawyer was silent, the chairman sprang up in alarm, exclaiming, "Acquit Raffles in absentia? Raffles is here, after all." I am sorry to say that Raffles has kept his promise, he did not appear as a defendant. Breathless silence followed. One could have heard a pin drop. The chairman addressed the defendant. "So that means you're not Raffles?" Defendant was silent. The lawyer, however, rose again and continued. "I believe that everything I have said in favor of my client has struck the judges, especially because they themselves know that everything I have said is true. And therefore it might be possible that the gentleman, perhaps out of great admiration for Raffles, would acquit this wretch who stands before us as a defendant. But this man is a real criminal, a threefold murderer, one of those from whom nothing can be saved, who commit crimes out of lust for evil, and who must therefore be handed over to justice. I therefore put this defendant in the hands of the court." Another pause ensued. The president then asked the defendant several questions. And this one, realizing that there was no way out for him, that his identity had been established, confessed that he was Fritz, the long-sought thief and murderer. Defendant was taken to his cell, where he would remain until his case was heard again. Then the president turned to the defender with a pale face. "But where is Raffles?" The lawyer shrugged with a smile. Now the prosecutor rose to his full height with the words. "The defender painted us Raffles as a chivalrous man, whom the best of us could take an example from. Then how come this man doesn't keep his word? He has given me his word of honor to appear at the public hearing. He has not come." Again the defender smiled. "You are mistaken. He's there. Would you be so kind after this session, Attorney Dr. Free Newman from his home where he's been locked up? I am Raffles. With a single movement the speaker pulled off his wig and rubbed the folds and wrinkles from his face with his fingers. And all saw Raffles. There he stood, head held high, between the audience and the jurors, looking round and smiling. And before any of those present had recovered from his astonishment, he had disappeared with a single leap, through the astonished policeman. Raffles. Innumerable mouths poured out this word at once, and in the next moment everyone rushed to the doors to hunt for Raffles, the great unknown. In an instant the whole building was on stilts. They ran down the stairs, down the corridors, but Raffles was gone. He was also not found in the surrounding streets. Raffles, however, had not fled the house. Calmly, he had opened a small door that was adjacent to the public hall and led to a small room where the jurors gathered to decide the fate of a defendant. There he had taken a seat at the table and put a few lines on paper. And when it had become quiet again in the courthouse, because people were looking for Raffles in the street, he had taken his coat and hat, dressed himself and left the building with his collar turned up. "Has Raffles been caught yet?" he asked, passing a couple of excited police officers. "No, sir, doctor, that is the devil himself." Raffles left the building laughing through a side door. When the jurors had gathered in the small room, they found on the table the note with the following contents. "I had to get my fur coat and hat from here. I greet you warmly. See you next time. Raffles." Thus ended this adventure of the great unknown. The next part will contain the Silver Apostle. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.